Hey everybody, this is just a little demo to give you an idea of what the demos are going to look like now that I'm going to be pre-recording them. Okay, so it's going to be just like we do in our regular classes, except this time I'll be able to do it beforehand so that you can watch well in advance of when we have our Q&A sessions. Okay, so I'm just going to paint a little apple. This is one I've probably done before, so here we go. I'm going to do just like I always do, and I'm going to switch over to my demo cam. There we go. So you can see I have my reference image, excuse me, of the apples on my phone. I have my palette over here, and I've got my paper. This happens to be some good quality Arches paper. And so I'm just going to do a quick little painting of these apples. And I've got my usual colors out here. I have some alizarin crimson, some Winsor red, some Prussian blue, some ultramarine blue, some Winsor yellow, and some raw sienna. And so I'm going to just move this up a little because you probably are more interested in seeing my palette than in seeing that reference image. You should have that reference image in front of you or have it printed out when you're working. I'll just throw mine up there just so that you can see it for now. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of that alizarin and I'm just going to block in the shape of my apple. I'm just going to do this little one that's right here. And I'm going to get that placed where I want it and in the size I want it. And I'm just using straight up alizarin crimson with a fair amount of water in it. And we're going to get a little bit of some shadow on that left side because that's where I'm seeing the majority of the shadow on this little piece of fruit there. Okay, and so get that blocked in. As you know, to get a darker value when you're working with watercolors, you just use less water and more paint. You want a lighter value, you use more water and a little less paint. I'm going to put just a little bit of some raw sienna in with that mix, okay? Because I see a little bit of it. The raw sienna makes it get a little bit more earthy, a little bit less pinky red, okay? And so I'm going to add a little bit of that as we move to the right-hand side of this, so that not only will I be warming it up and lightening it up a little bit, but it'll just have a little bit more color variation. And apples, skin of apples, whether they're red or green, they always have lots and lots of color variation in them. So that's what I want to get. Okay, so we've got that blocked in. I'm going to just take a little bit of some Prussian blue in with some of this alizarin. And on that left side, where I really want it to feel like it's in shadow, I'm going to put a little bit of that down. Now this is still wet, so it's going to run a little bit. And I don't mind that. To me, that just gives it a slightly more natural flow. It makes things transition a little more gradually. And if you're working on a sheet like this, which is the Arches paper, it makes some nice transitions. Excuse me. Some of the other papers, if they're not quite as high quality, you might get a little bit of more backwashes and that sort of thing. But on the Arches paper, typically it's going to hold up pretty nicely. Okay, so we've got our first pass on this apple blocked in. The next thing I want to do is I want to start to get some of that nice green foliage in there. So I'm going to take some of my Prussian blue and I'm going to take a little bit of this raw sienna. Okay. And I am going to start getting some of this foliage that is around the apple because it's hanging on a tree, and we don't have to paint the whole tree, but we can sort of imply that that's what it's doing. We're going to get some of that blocked in, and I want that to be relatively neutral. And so that's why I'm using that nice mix of Prussian blue with the raw sienna. That always gives me a very, very nice neutral sort of looking green. It's a very organic, natural looking color. Okay, and that's what I want to have. I want this to really look believable. Our edges are still wet, so if you don't want things to run, you've got to just sort of leave a little bit of some room You can either blot it up a little bit like I just did, or don't worry about it. Let it run, let it have a little bit of some soft edges. Soft edges are always a good thing to have in any painting. You want to have a combination of soft and hard edges. What that will do is that will ensure that your piece actually recedes where it's supposed to recede and comes forward where you want it to come forward. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of some Winsor yellow and just introduce a little bit of that into that green mixture that I have. What that's going to do is that's going to allow me to now, on this lower part where we've got some foliage that's a little bit lighter, you can start to pull a little bit of that in. Again, I just bumped into the edge of that, and so it ran a little bit on me, but that's okay. It's okay to have a little bit of some parts of your painting running into other parts, right? Okay, so let's get a little bit of this over here, and we can start to imply some of the lighter tones of greens that are on that foliage that's up at the top area there. Okay, just a bit. Get some of that in here to suggest some of those stems. And then we're going to let things dry just a bit. And what I want to do while that stuff is drying is I just want to talk to you a little bit about what we've got going on over in these areas. Okay, so we have lots of this nice foliage as sort of a backdrop. And whenever you do foliage, try to think of it very, very, very abstractly, really whatever subject it is that you're doing. Try not to get too caught up in what it is that you're painting or in specific areas of whatever it is you're painting. Just try to look for shapes. Like for instance, down here, we have another apple. I'm going to just imply that by making a nice sort of circular stroke. Okay, just to hint at the idea of there being something else down in that area. And then I'll take a little more of that raw sienna and alizarin mix and throw a little bit of that in this top section of it. We'll put the little spot in there for where there's some of the stem is going to connect, but it also has some really, really nice light green foliage around it. And I just want that to feel, you know, very ephemeral, not a real hard edged sort of a thing. Okay, so some of this is starting to dry. What's really going to make this pop is when we start to get a little bit of some more really, we don't have any really dark darks in there in the background yet. Okay, and that's what's going to help to make everything pop and come forward and hold together. Okay, so to get a really dark I'm going to stick with this Prussian blue. Okay, I'm going to put more of that in with this green. And then I'm going to take some alizarin and I'm going to throw some of that in there. Now, red and green are opposite one another on the color wheel. And so if I add any red to a green, it's going to make that green a lot more neutral. And what that will do is that will be an effective shadow color as well as give me that really, really nice, deep, dark value that I need to have to make some of these edges pop. Okay, so let's see, our apple is pretty dry right in this area. So I'm going to take some of that dark and I'm going to put that down right in this area. And then I'm going to just let it sort of fade out as it moves to the right. That's another thing. Don't feel like you have to have these super defined edges around everything. Let certain parts of it just sort of fade out and fade into nothing. It doesn't have to have like a name to whatever it is in the background. Okay, it's really there for support material. Okay, so then we'll pull a little bit of that into there. And what that does is that just creates some atmosphere and it creates an environment for your subject to sort of exist in. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit of this nice dark tone in here, and we can in here use it to create some negative shapes that will then imply, some stems that the apple can be hanging on, a connection to the tree, that sort of thing. Okay, and we'll get a little bit of it in here, and I'm just using my reference photo purely as a departure point. So wherever I see darks, I'm putting in some dark shapes. What that does is that allows me to just make things come forward where I need them to come forward, make them recede where I need them to recede. Okay, so up in here, what I want to do is I want to get a little bit more, a tiny bit more of some, well, you get a little bit of some greens first on a little bit of this foliage here. I have to be very careful and just move through this in a way that I'm adding color in to areas that are already dry if I don't want things to run. If it's an area that I'm not worried about bleeding and that kind of thing, doesn't matter. I can do it whether it's wet or I can do it whether it's dry. But in some places where I want to have some hard edges, I'm going to have to be patient, which for me is hard, and just wait until things dry. Like for instance, right over here, we had a little bit of bleed. Not a problem. When that is dry, what I can do is just go right back over that with a little bit more of the color of the apple. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit more of my alizarin, because what I want to do, sometimes when we add some golden tones in with our reds, sometimes things can start to get a little too orange, and we don't want our apple to look like it's an orange. I want it to look like an apple. So I'm going to take some of that alizarin and I'm going to let it be really dark, really red, and I'm going to just put some of that down in these places. I'm going to squint at it wherever I'm seeing some really, really dark values. Okay, red apples are a little more difficult to paint than green apples because they have a lot of color variation in them. They have a lot of dark values, and sometimes it's difficult to see those value changes and those value shifts with a red object. So that makes it a little more challenging. I'm going to put just a little bit less red down as I move to the right, because remember, that's the lighter side of our apple. So we want to keep that a little bit lighter. It does get dark at the bottom, and so that will give us an opportunity to just clean up that edge a little tiny bit. Okay, and then I'm going to just take a little bit of water and just lightly drag it through here just to soften up any marks that just look a little too strong. Okay, it's nice though to be able to see brush strokes. So don't feel like you have to make everything be this smooth transition from one value or color into the other. Okay, so we've got a very nice, very loosely painted apple right now. The only thing that I would like to do is sharpen up a few edges. So I'm going to take some Prussian blue and I'm going to take some alizarin. I'm not using a lot of water. I'm going to even take a little bit of my raw sienna in with that. I want to make a very, very nice, very dark, sort of a neutral tone. And I'm going to use that to just carve out some edges in a few places so that we get some of that nice depth that we want to have. So for instance, right in here, I see a little bit of sort of a triangular trapezoid-like shape. That's just going to be what's needed to pull out the edge of that apple. Okay, same thing over here. So it's kind of like what you're doing is you're making a nice optically connected, it doesn't have to be literally physically touching the area that I'm talking about, but optically these connections need to flow into one another, because what they'll do is they will tell your viewer where to look and how to explore your composition, and they'll keep your viewer engaged with it so that they don't get bored and go look at something else. Okay, see how those darks I just put in there just made that apple pop so much more. We're going to drag just a little bit of it down here. I don't want to do a complete outline because that's not going to look natural either. You want it to feel like a very, very natural sort of a transition. I just want to get a little more dark in there and make that feel like it's, really casting some shadows. We can square off a few edges. You know how I like to do that with fruit. I don't like it to be perfectly round because then it looks like it's fake fruit. Okay, we don't want fake fruit. We want it to look real and believable. Okay, I love the way this really looks like that stem is going right into the center part of that apple. One other color that I would love to see a little bit more of in here is some of this alizarin and a little bit more raw sienna. I want to make sort of like a burnt sienna color. You might say, well, why don't you just take some burnt sienna paint and put that on there? I could do that. But as you guys know that have worked with me for a while, you know that I like to limit the palette so that it remains cohesive, and you don't have too many colors in there that start to fight with one another, because that's when things can either start to get garish or start to get muddy, and we don't want either of those things to happen. So I just mixed up a little bit more my bright green, Prussian blue, and Winsor yellow. I just want to throw a little tiny bit of that on there in some of these spots, just to get a slightly brighter sense of green in some of the foliage. Now that we have those darks in there, we can use these wonderful bright greens as contrast. Also, some of my paint is dry now, so if I want to go in and put some implied detail in there, now is a great time for me to be able to do that. Okay, so I like this. I want to keep this part here nice and light, nice and neutral, so that it contrasts nicely with the brightness of the apple. But we can also throw a little bit of some of those brights down in a few other places, maybe just lift a little bit of this off so it's not quite as dark. There we go. I like the softness of that. But that's really going to be just about it for this one. So as I said, I wanted to do this little demo just to give you an idea of what the demonstrations are going to look like, the type of information that I'm going to be distributing. As I said, it is just exactly the same as everything when I was doing these demos live in each Zoom class. The benefit now is you get to watch it ahead of time, so that when we do have our live Zoom sessions and we do get together for question and answer and critique, you'll have already had the opportunity to see the demo, to watch it as many times as you want, and it'll still be available to you after the Q&A sessions for as long as you want it. You can watch it over and over again until you feel like you've really got the lesson down and understand everything. And I think it's going to be a great way for you to really, really get even more out of these online classes. Okay, so thanks, and I will see you in the first Q&A session.